Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We are going to begin, as always, with our listener mailbag.
You've got mail.
Our first message is a response to last week's episode about tournament conditions. It's from YouTube, and the username is @Sumologike, and they write, another aspect of weekend tournaments, especially big ones like the various amateur team events, that makes them so unenjoyable is the number of kids who play. But along with that is all the behavior that comes with children, running around, being loud, coughing and sneezing in your face and on the pieces during play, picking their nose at the board, not knowing how to offer draws, adjusting pieces randomly on your time. Then there is all the arrogant and rude behavior, such as mocking lower-rated players than themselves and their clique, making fun of older players, and so on. Sure, not all kids do this, but enough of them do, even the higher-rated ones. Sure, you can inform the TDs of issues, but that's besides the point. The damage is done. It took me a while to figure out why my rating kept going down, despite my chess knowledge and skill increasing, and it was for a whole year I hated the tournament conditions and didn't realize that this was the problem until I lost 130 rating points. Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm sorry you went through that. Now, a lot of the behavior you described, as far as kids running around, being loud, they're adjusting pieces on your time, not knowing how to offer draws, or a lot of times they offer repeated draws. Yeah, all that stuff drives me crazy. And the issue is, and I've said this before, there are two types of kids at chess tournaments. There are kids who play chess, which are your more mature kids. They're respectful. They're gracious when they lose. They're not exhibiting any of that annoying behavior. And then there's bratty chess kids. And it's the bratty chess kids that really can, make these weekend tournaments an issue, where they're just not behaving properly. They think they can do whatever they want. They're disrespectful, and it's a shame. And I like your comment, even if you inform the TD and they warn them, the damage is done. And a lot of times, from what I'm hearing, the TDs will, they'll issue a warning, but then it just continues once they leave. So that's a shame. Now, the annoying behavior you described, unfortunately, that's typical, but the part where you explain the behavior where they're mocking lower rated players and making fun of older players, I'm going to be honest, that's the first I'm hearing of that, but I haven't really played in a major weekend event in a while. But if you're saying this occurs, I'm sure others have gone through it. Now, that's completely different. It's one thing if you're playing a child who's just being loud and coughing and all that stuff, but if they're mocking lower rated players and making fun of older players, that's on a different level. Like, that's where we're looking at being disqualified from rounds or even being kicked out of the tournament. Because if behavior like that existed at my club where, they were like mocking low-rated players or something like that, they wouldn't last. So I'm not sure the particular situation because I'm looking at this in the abstract, but that's a serious problem. If a TD knows that someone is mocking a low-rated player or making fun of an older player, like you said, that's pretty serious. Like, nobody should go through that. Most of what I heard about kids is the first part of your message about the annoying behavior. The fact that they're kind of getting together in a clique, some of these kids, and sort of harassing other players, that is absolutely not acceptable. And depending on how that was handled, if they were warned, and the severity of what's going on, again, I believe those are grounds for removal from the event because no one should have to deal with that. And I appreciate you sharing that. Our next message is from Dan via email. He says, "Hi, Neil, longtime listener, first-time emailer. I am a 50-year-old busy father of 2 young kids, 5 years and 9 years. I'm also an adult improver who just got into chess about 5 years ago. As part of my own improvement and to get my kids into chess, I volunteered to coach, quote unquote, my son's elementary school chess club. I've been doing it for a couple of years now and have successfully grown the club from 5 kids to 20 kids, and for a few of them to start playing in scholastic tournaments. My question for you, as the founder and manager of a club, is would you like to do an episode about starting, running, and managing a chess club? Some basic stuff like how to get started, what activities to offer, such as weekly rated games, casual blitz, simuls, game analysis, instruction, etc. I realize you run an adult club and I'm talking scholastic, but going over some stuff like this could make for an interesting episode. Also, maybe delve into getting TD certified, club ladder tournaments, etc. Anyway, thanks for the continued content. Keep up the great work, Dan. Well, Dan, thanks for the message. I think that's really cool you started the chess club. Now, I've spoken in a few previous episodes about some basic ideas about running a club, but what I'm going to do, I'll link up for you a packet. It's a PDF, and US Chess put it out about starting a chess club, and it has some great ideas. So I'll throw a link for that if anyone's interested. And as far as your scholastic club, it really depends on what direction you want to go in. Is it going to be more of a quote unquote fun, casual club where the kids are just going there to play and it's more of a social thing? Or are you looking for, like a Brooklyn Castle type thing where you want to run like a solid competitive chess program that's competing with other schools and traveling around the country? It really depends on what type of level you want to bring it to. Like I said, is it a casual club or do you really want to grow it to a competitive club? Sounds like a little bit of both because you did mention tournaments, but I would say generally speaking, you want to make sure the kids are playing. So if they're meeting after school for 45 minutes or an hour, it can't be like an hour of instruction. Maybe do like a puzzle or two in the beginning to teach a chess concept and then let the kids play. They're going to want to play each other. But then the important thing is I would walk around and kind of observe each game and maybe offer some tips and some comments. So they're definitely going to want to play. If you want to make it a more competitive club, if you're really looking to get people rated and like I said, travel the country and play in tournaments, then you're going to have to bring in some more instructional ideas. You're going to have to kind of structure a little bit more. Do you want to give them homework and worksheets? Really depends. Like I said, I'm not sure how much you want it to be casual and how much you want it to be competitive, like how far the pendulum is swinging on either side. But the fact that you brought it from 5 kids to 20, I think that's fantastic. And thanks for sharing that, Dan. I really appreciate it. Our final message this week is from David. He says, "Hey, Neil, cheers from Canada. I live in a somewhat rural community in BC, Canada." So yeah, just let me stop you there. Yeah, British Columbia, Canada, that's on like the west side, right? It's on the west end of the country. It's supposed to be beautiful. It's supposed to be really scenic. I definitely want to visit there one day. But anyhow, David continues, "The nearest chess club to me is an hour and a half drive away. It makes playing over the board a bit of a luxury as I have to pretty much take a day off work in order to participate. The club is small and there's a chance I'll show up to no opponent. Like you, I don't really care for long online games because I lose interest staring at the screen. However, I have recently started waking up early before work so I can play a longer time control where I use my board and just transfer the opponent's move myself. While it's not the same as true over the board play, it does feel a lot more satisfying. As an added bonus, I'm learning notation as well as improving my 30-minute rapid rating from 700 to 1300 on chess.com in a little over 2 months. Most of this is due to the focus the physical board gives, as well as moving my opponent's piece, which really makes me question their intent. Was wondering about your thoughts on playing longer time controls with a physical board rather than a computer screen or possibly an electronic board such as a Chestnut Pro. Anyway, I hope you win your next game, and thank you for the show. I really look forward to it on my drive to work." Well, thank you so much, David, for the kind words. We touched on this, I believe, in a previous listener mailbag, but I'm glad you wrote about it again. many players like yourself like to use a physical board when they play online. That's definitely a thing, and it gives you that tactile experience. Like you said, it's not the same or quite the same as over the board, but it's the next best thing. So yeah, that's absolutely a thing. I think it's great that you do that. I don't do that only because I'm okay looking at a screen. Now, it's funny. When I first started playing online, see, I started on, I can't say this without laughing. I started on Yahoo Chess. All right. Anyone who's old like me remembers Yahoo Chess. And it was basically this online free website. You know, it was like part of the Yahoo games. Like they had Yahoo Chess, I think Yahoo Checkers. It was all these different games. And chess was one of them. It was completely free. I don't think it was rated. This is a long time ago, but anyone who's my age remembers Yahoo Chess. And when I first did it, it was really, really weird playing from a screen. I guess that two-dimensional factor. And when I first started doing it, I actually did use a board in front of me because it was so odd. But then after a while, I got rid of the board and just got used to looking at it online. And then, of course, I got into using the computer to analyze my games. I used Fritz for a long time. And so I just got used to it because I was using the computer from a long time. But when I first did that, when I first started using a computer screen more for my chess study, I did have a physical board for a while, but then I got rid of it. So I'm just used to it now. But many people like yourself still like to keep it. So that's totally fine. And if it's helping you, I think that's great. I also like what you said about the fact that you're moving your opponent's piece because you're using the physical board. Your opponent makes the move online, and then you make his move on your physical set. There's something about that process that helps you understand his ideas or try to understand your opponent's ideas as well. So I think that's great. And you said you got your rapid from 700 to 1300 in a little over 2 months. That's fantastic. So what I would say, if using the physical board works for you, keep on doing it because many people like yourself do the same thing and they're big advocates for it and it really helps them. Really appreciate it, David. Thanks so much. Now we're going to jump to our main content for this week. This is a game analysis episode. I haven't done one of these in a while. For those of you new to the pod, what I do in these game analysis episodes is I discuss thematically a game that I played at the club and what the major takeaways from it were. What themes, ideas did I learn from it? What themes and ideas can we all learn from it? We talk a little bit about openings, about chess psychology, some chess theory to be aware of. So it's really about important takeaways that we can apply to all our games, things that we need to remind ourselves of. It is not a blindfold chess thing. I'm not going to go through specific moves like I played this, he played this. It's not blindfold chess. But what I always do with these game analysis episodes is I put a PGN in the show notes. So if you want to copy and paste it into an engine, you can see what I did, which wasn't great for this game. So this was actually an instructive loss because, as I said, I'm not just going to put games where I played really well and won. That's kind of lame. This is a game that I lost, but it was very, very instructive. And of course, our losses tend to be more instructive than our wins. But it's what I call a good loss because I basically made one blunder at the end that cost the game. But other than that, I played well. But it's just a very good learning game. Like, the thing about a good loss like this is fine. You lose the game, that stinks, but the takeaways and the instruction you get from it can actually help you long term. And so for these episodes, I try to use games where, again, they're very instructive. It's practical things. It's things you're going to face in your own games at the amateur level. It's not this sort of abstract, odd things that you're never going to see. I only try to put things on this podcast and in the episodes where it's stuff you're actually going to face in your games. So I was black here. My opponent was white, obviously, and he's maybe 9th or 10th grader. I'm not sure, but he's definitely probably going to be a master at some point. He was about 1750 when I played him here, quote unquote 1750, because I think he's a lot stronger. And he opened with F4, which is the bird's opening, which was interesting. I haven't seen that in a while. Now, the bird's opening generally is not considered the most sound, but it's actually okay to play, and it's very interesting. And I think at the amateur level, it can be very effective. Now, one of the advantages of F4, it's a great surprise factor. So if you're playing someone who's kind of booked up, who's very theoretical, they're going to expect something like E4 or D4, C4, maybe knight F3. So F4 is not something they would expect in a classical over-the-board club game. F4 would be more like a 3-0 blitz game online. So it's a very good surprise move. And he did kind of catch me off guard. Not that I was freaking out. I've seen it before, but certainly didn't expect it. So he played F4, and then I had to stop and think for a minute. So when you face an opening that's a surprise that you haven't seen in a while, that you've never seen, the main thing is you can't rush. You really have to take your time. Don't sort of get sucked into the tempo of your opponent. And what I recommend, try to use an opening that you already know that can answer this unconventional opening, or try to steer it towards a pawn structure that you already understand. And so I responded with B6. Now, the idea of knight F6 and then B6 and bishop B7, kind of a Queen's Indian type of structure where I'm controlling the E4 square, I use that as a defense against almost anything other than E4. So my thinking was, he played F4, I played B6, I'm going to fiend Keto, bishop B7, and then I'm going to go knight F6. And the reason I played B6 right away, I kind of wanted to beat him to the punch if he fiend Ketos on the king side. And remember, one of the disadvantages of F4 is that he's opening up his king side a little bit. So G2 could be a weakness, but also the E1 H4 diagonal, that dark squared diagonal towards white's king, is vulnerable. So I have to be, he has to be careful. At some point, am I going to be able to get in like, Queen H4 check or something like that, a tactic there? So that was my thinking. But I ended up using a Queen's Indian type of structure where it's knight F6, B6, bishop B7, E6, bishop E7. And as I've said many times before, you can use a Queen's Indian setup, or almost like a hedgehog type of setup, against a lot of different openings that white plays. Okay, so the Queen's Indian doesn't have to be just after like D4, C4, and knight F3. All right, I use the Queen's Indian against the London. I use it against a lot of things. And the reason I'm using it here is because A, I know the opening, and B, it worked very well against his F4 opening. So always try to respond to an unconventional opening using your own opening repertoire, or at least a pawn structure you're familiar with. Like what I could have done is after F4, I could have played something like D5 or C5 right away, which is fine. But now we're getting into something that I'm not sure how to follow up with. So I stuck with more of a system type of opening, a structure, and decided to go from there. I didn't want to overthink it here. But again, going back to the birds opening, I think it's a good surprise. Usually white's plan, he's going to follow up with maybe E3, knight F3. He might do B3 and then bishop B2, fiend Ketoing his dark squared bishop to gain more control. These are different ideas. It depends. A lot of times white will try to attack black's king, but because he's opening on the flank, I'm going to look to play in the center. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So that was my thinking there. Now, I mentioned fighting for the center. That's the second sort of takeaway. So the first sort of theme or takeaway was dealing with the birds opening or just a surprise opening in general. The second thing is you have to fight for the center or you're going to get crushed. Very, very important. And typically if white is going to play on the flank, you're going to then play in the center as black. So one thing I did, and if you put the PGN in an engine, you'll see I hit at the center very, very well because I wanted to have control and I didn't want to get crushed. So you have to look at ideas like D5, like C5, things like that. You need to control the center because if you let white get an attack or if he controls the center first, you're just going to get crushed. And especially if you're playing something like the Queen's Indian, which is a little bit more of a solid setup, you do need to strike at the center at some point. So fighting for control at the center, is very important. I know that's cliche and we've heard it, but a lot of players don't do it or they'll get distracted with something else. Like a lot of players, they'll see something like f4 and they'll think, oh, that diagonal towards his king is open. How can I mate him? But the truth is, it doesn't call for that. And as soon as he plays knight f3, the h4 square is controlled anyway. I mean, it's something you have to be aware of, but I knew he was a strong enough player that he wasn't just going to let me sort of steamroll him like that. All right, but fighting for control of the center, very, very important. We're now going to take a short break, and we'll be back to discuss this game in just a moment. So the next takeaway from this game, which is something that we need to remind ourselves, especially beginners and developing players, you have to be careful of those unnecessary defensive moves, specifically, when you move your rook pawn or your h pawn by your castled king. So in other words, those h6 moves as black or those h3 moves as white, you have to be careful with those because they could weaken your position, or they're just unnecessary and you're losing a tempo when you could have developed your piece or done something else. Now, yes, there are times, absolutely, where playing like h3 or h6 is correct. You may need to give your king space, or what they call luft, let's say to prevent a back rank mate or something, or in some cases it might prevent an attack, or it'll keep a knight or a bishop off of that square on the G file, that type of thing, so he can't get a mating attack. Yes, there are times where you have to play h3 or h6, but many amateurs, and I still fall for this myself sometimes, even players rated 2000 and above fall for this, where they'll just play h3 or h6 where it's just not necessary, where you could have developed. And that's tough to do. Now, sometimes when you play h6 or h3, it's not bad, it's just not necessary, and it's probably okay because it does give your king space, it does prevent your opponent's piece from hopping closer to your king, but other times it could also weaken your king side, and if you push that h-pawn, if he has a bishop aimed at it, there might be a situation where he can sack it, and then you take with the g-pawn, and then there's a file open towards your king. So you really have to analyze there. But what a lot of players do is they'll see that a queen is eyeing their king. Like the opponent will make a simple move, moving their queen off the back rank, and it eyes your king, and then players freak out, and they feel like, well, I have to move that h-pawn because he might mate me. But you have to say, is he just moving his queen? Is there really anything there? Or can you develop a piece and deal with that later if necessary? So in the game I played, he had moved his queen from d1 to c2. Remember, he has the white pieces. And so he's hitting my h7 square against my castled king. I didn't move my h-pawn because there's nothing there. I had a knight on f6. It's not threatening anything. So I simply followed his queen move by developing my own queen to c7 because I saw that there was nothing there. It turns out if I had played h6, that would have been fine, and the computer says it's okay, and I could have, but I didn't have to. The whole point about the h6 or h3 moves is you don't want to do it if it's a blunder. There are times people do that, and it actually worsens their position. So you got to be careful about that. The next idea or theme is about calculation, specifically when you need to calculate and when you don't. That is very, very important. Now, you may say, well, don't you always have to calculate? But there are certain times where the position is just so clear and thematic that you're just going to lose time on your clock. In other words, you're complicating a position when you don't need to. So you got to be careful that you're not calculating where it's not necessary because it's very straightforward, and then you're going to lose time on your clock. Let me explain what I mean because that might not be clear. So my opponent played a move where he played f5. So he's kind of attacking a bit. He's pushing his pawn. And this is a type of situation where, yes, I did need to calculate because it wasn't that straightforward. An example of where you don't need to calculate and where you could lose time is like if there's an open file and it's like, well, do I move my A rook there? Do I go rook A to E1 or rook F to E1? They call that the which rook scenario. I've spoken about that. That's an example where most of the time, probably better than 90% of the time, it really doesn't matter which rook you put there. I mean, as long as you check it tactically, but people will obsess over that when often it doesn't make a difference. So that's an example of calculation where you're just going to waste time on your clock. Here, I needed to calculate because, do I take his pawn? Do I move something else? And I really took my time here, and then I found the correct move, which was to exchange. And anytime there are lines where you can exchange pieces, you really have to look at those because that can often turn the tide of the game. A good exchange can give you a better position or can equalize, and a bad exchange could easily have you losing. So you really need to look at lines. And it turns out I found a knight trade here that was correct. And after I played this move, I was actually up. The evaluation was minus 2.34 pawn units, which that's pretty strong. Now remember, if it had said it was only like minus 0.56, that's nothing, but minus 2.34, that's a little over 2 pawns. That's pretty strong. So it wasn't like I was crushing him, but I definitely was winning here after that. And you'll see where I made the mistake later on. But this was an example where you do need to calculate those critical positions. Other times, maybe not. And that's something that you develop as a player with experience as you analyze your games with the computer. Do I really need to stop and calculate here? Or is the response so straightforward that I'm just, I'm overthinking here and I'm going to lose time on my clock? Because knowing when to calculate and when you don't really need to calculate that deeply, that's a major aspect of clock management. The next idea is material versus initiative. So what we mean by that is one player could have more material, they could be up a pawn or even a piece, but the other player has the initiative, meaning control of the game. So if you have a winning attack, but you're down a piece, it really doesn't matter because your attack's going to win the game, and the fact that your opponent is up material doesn't matter. But reading that correctly, like understanding material versus initiative and playing the right moves is completely something else. See, one of the difference between amateurs and the pros or title players is that there might be a position where, let's say you have like a 2300 player and a 1700 player. Both the 1700 and the 2300 might understand that, okay, black has the initiative here, but white has more material, but black's initiative should win out. But the difference is the 2300 player is going to find the correct moves to take advantage of that initiative, whereas the 1700 player is going to understand that there's an initiative, but he's going to misplay it. And that's one of the major things that separates amateurs from title players, is that we kind of understand what's happening on some level, but we don't know the right moves. And that's something that's not discussed enough. It's one thing to read the position correctly. It's another thing to play the right moves. So for example, let's say you have the 2 bishops and the position's a little bit open. Oh, I have the 2 bishops, right? And we've all heard that, having the 2 bishops is an advantage. Knowing that though is not enough. You need to play the right moves. And that's one of the weaknesses of the amateur player, is that we know that we're supposed to be quote unquote better, that we're supposed to have the initiative, but we can't calculate the right moves to play it. Whereas the pros will easily figure it out. So something to keep in mind. And that's kind of what happened here. I misplayed my initiative and we ended up with an equal position. All right. So I was winning. I didn't blow the game, but I basically blew my advantage. And the reason I'm mentioning material here, he had this bishop takes h7 check. It wasn't a Greek gift thing. In other words, his queen and bishop were on the same diagonal. So in other words, he goes bishop takes h7 check. I can't take the bishop because his queen's protecting it. And I was worried about that, but it turns out it was a nothing pawn. He can actually take bishop takes h7. I slide my king over to the h file, and then I'm actually still winning because his king was somewhat vulnerable. And I kind of saw this, but I misread it. And I should have just not worried about that pawn. I misplayed it. Okay, fine. That's how it goes. So I didn't blunder here. I'm not losing, but I went from being better to now equal. All right, typical at the amateur level. So I'm okay here, but now we get to the final idea that we're going to discuss, which is sacrificing material at the amateur level. This is a big topic. So there are 2 types of sacrifices. Now, these are the labels that I use. I didn't come up with these. Now, there might be some disagreement, or maybe it's semantics on whether it's a sacrifice or a combination, but these are the terms that I use. So the thing you have to think about and analyze is when to quote unquote go for it, which would be a speculative or thematic sacrifice, meaning that you don't quite see it through to the end. You don't see the specific move sequence, but the themes and the theory tell you that it's correct, that type of thing, versus playing what I call a combination. A combination, in my mind, is when you see it through to the end. So you sack a piece, but you see, let's say, all his moves are forced and it's going to lead to mate. That's a combination. I don't consider that a true sacrifice. So is it a speculative or thematic sacrifice, or is it a combination? So I recommend, and I know higher players have agreed with me on this, you should only play a combinational sacrifice where you clearly see it through to the end. Or you can play a thematic sacrifice where you don't see it through, but only if it's extremely obvious. Like, let me give an example. About a couple months ago, I had a game where I sacked a piece for 2 pawns. I didn't see it through the end, but it was just so ridiculously obvious that I didn't need to calculate. So what do I mean by obvious? His king was in the middle because he had messed up earlier on. His position was a mess. His pieces were all over the place and uncoordinated. His king is in the middle of the board. The queens are still on the board. My rook is on an open file and can check his king on the rank. And his queenside knight and rook hadn't even moved yet. So his rook might as well be off the board. And he doesn't have time to develop. And I said, okay, even if I'm wrong, like, I'm going to get this crazy attack. I'm going to have 2 pawns for the piece, which is not that much of a deficit. But I saw all these checks. It was just so obvious that it was the right move. And he ended up resigning 3 moves later. So that was an example where I didn't see each move through to the end. But because of basic chess theory, right? His king is still in the middle. You want to crack open the center to get to his king. He's not developed. His pieces are all over the place. I have all these checks. There was like 6 ways till Sunday to win this, that I went for it. In that case, it's okay to play a thematic sacrifice where you don't see it through. But other than that, I would generally only sacrifice where you see it through to the end. The TLDR would be, I would not sacrifice a piece if you're confused, if you don't see it through, if those common themes aren't there. Like, I wouldn't sacrifice like, I'm not sure if this works, let me try this. Don't do that. We're not playing a 3-0 blitz game. So I would avoid speculative sacrifices. Now here in this game, I thought it was combinational. I thought I calculated through the end, and it turns out he had one move. He had one move that defends correctly during the sequence, and he found it. I had saw this move, but I didn't realize that it was winning for him. So what happened in this game, I sacked a bishop. I thought it worked. It didn't. And I basically resigned a few moves later, shook his hand. I smiled. I said, yeah, that sack didn't work. And I'm taking losses a lot better than I used to. But a couple of things about this. Let's just talk about the psychology of sacrificing pieces. Number one, very often at the club level, and I've won a number of games like this, you will misplay a sacrifice, but you'll still win because of the intimidation and the psychological factor. In other words, your opponent misses the correct response. So you sack a piece, and he's so thrown off by it that rather than just remain calm and find the correct refutation, they just kind of freak out and you win anyway. Now, that could have happened here. He was too strong of a player, but that's happened to me. I've won games that way where I misread a sack and I should have lost, but then his response was even worse. So it was kind of like, a double question mark move followed by like a triple question mark move, right? Whoever makes the next to last mistake wins. So that's happened. And I've also been the victim of that. I've had opponents where they'll sack a piece against me. It's losing, but I didn't defend properly. And I could have won, but I misplayed it. So that happens a lot at the club level. Even if your sacrifice is unsound, you might still win. Now, don't take that as, well, then shouldn't you just sacrifice all the time? No, because against a competent player, it's likely not going to happen. All right, but something to keep in mind. So another night, I could have made this wrong sacrifice against another player, and they might not have found the best response. and I would have mated them in one. So that happens. Now, the big issue for me, the big conundrum, and I'm guessing a lot of you go through this too, is that I don't sack a piece when I should, and then I do sack a piece when I shouldn't, as I did in this game. So my problem is the former. I don't sacrifice when I should because I am a very positional, like solid player. I like to just sort of grind my opponent down. And what happens is I'll see this sacrifice and something's telling me that it's correct. But because of my rule that I generally will not sack unless I see it through or unless it's really obvious, I end up not playing it. Now, that has kept me out of a lot of trouble. Okay, my rule of, generally speaking, not sacking a piece unless you see it through, that's kept me out of a lot of trouble. I think my rating would be much lower if I didn't have that belief. But what happens is I'll see a sack, I don't play it, and then as a result, the win ends up taking much longer than it should, or I won't get the win. I'll end up either drawing the game or losing when I could have made it a lot quicker. So that's a calculation thing that I need to work on. And then what happens is, I go back to the computer. I'm like, oh, I probably should have played like, knight takes d6 check and sack my knight. And it turns out that this move that I thought was correct, and I should have played it. But then you got to ask yourself, even if I did play it, are you going to be able to handle the follow-up? Now, there were other times where I was convinced a sack was correct. I didn't play it, and it turns out it was wrong. So that's why I say just be very, very careful and very judicious about sacrificing in your over-the-board club games with slow time controls. What's my point here? I'm kind of glad that I went for it in this game. I mean, even though technically I really didn't go for it because I thought I had it calculated, but it was just kind of good that I played it because there were so many times where I should play it and I don't. It's something I struggle with. And that calculation is difficult. Whereas a stronger player would have seen immediately, nope, this sack doesn't work because on, move 3 of the combination, he tucks his king back and then you have no follow-up. This was what I call a good loss because except for this bad sack, I played well. I was a little bit better for much of the game, and I learned a lot from it. So now for future games, that's the thing about losses. It's an investment. You lose one game, but then your return on investment is really high because you get so many takeaways from the game, which is another reason why I'm always saying you have to analyze your games. You have to look at your games. You have to look at your losses. In the past, 15, 20 years ago, I would have had a loss like this, and I would have thrown the score sheet out in the tournament hall on the way home, which is, that's almost criminal because you're giving up on all that instruction. So now I just look at the games. And last thing I'll say, don't be the player, because there's a lot of them out there who thinks the goal is to sack a piece every game. Like there are players who do this. All right. I've been running a chess club for a long time. I see a lot of amateur games. It's like, yeah, I want to sack a piece. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to sack a piece this game. I'm feeling it. No, that is going to get you into trouble. Okay, save that attitude for your bullet and blitz games online. In an over-the-board classical game at your club, you don't sack a piece because you feel like it. You sack a piece because that's what the position calls for, and that's the best move. Your opponent's king is in the middle. You have an initiative. The queens are still on the board. His pieces are all uncoordinated. Yeah. Sacking a piece to open up the center to get to his king is probably going to be correct because everything's going for you. But don't just sack a piece just because you feel like it. You have to go by what the position calls for. Playing like it's bullet chess, that's a different thing. So yeah, don't be the player who thinks like you're supposed to sack a piece every game, right? Yeah, it's not real chess unless I'm sacking a piece. They're out there. But in the long run, that's going to get you into trouble. Against lower rated players, you can probably get away with that. But once you start playing more competent players, they're just going to eat you alive if you do that because they're going to just take your piece, they're going to defend, and then you're just down a piece for nothing, and then they're going to steamroll you and your position's going to bust. So that will do it for this week. Some good takeaways from this game. Again, there is a PGN of the game in the show notes if you want to check it out. I know many of you like to do that. So this is the first game analysis episode we've done in a while. So hope you enjoyed it. As always, we really appreciate you listening, and I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.